To clear something up here for a second. Now, I just finished the 5th disc of the rock and roll box of the history of rock and roll. There was no punk movement in 1990, 1991. That wasn't punk. That was Nirvana and Green Day and Offspring. Not a bit of that was punk rock. Let me explain to you when punk rock originally started forming. It was 1969 with Iggy Pop and the Stooges. For those of you who don't know who that is, Iggy Pop was a standalone singer, and then he later on got with the Stooges. And then he left and then went back to the Stooges. They did a little bit back and forth stuff in 1969 through about 1971, 1972. 1973 and 1974 was about the time where MC5, a couple of others like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols started performing. And then it went up to 1976 where punk rock blew up. If you look up punk rock, 9 times out of 10 on Google Images, you'll find a big British sign that says, established in 1976, punk rock, punk's not dead, established 1976, stuff like that. And why it was 1976 was in fact because of the Sex Pistols. They came out with God Save the Queen in 1977 when they signed on to A&E on EMI. They came out with, Anarchy in the UK. Stuff like that. It was phenomenal music. Their one that they did was actually live. And when they came out in 1976 and 1977, they actually started doing an interview on Bill Grundy. Bill Grundy did an interview on them, and they started cussing and swearing. They didn't know the show was live or on TV or anything, and then Johnny Rotten clearly states that. And as time goes on in this interview, "You dirty fucker," says Steve Jones. And Bill Grundy goes, "What was that?" He goes, "You dirty bastard." Stuff like that. And Bill Grundy gets suspended for 2 weeks. The Sex Pistols make it on the cover of every newspaper and became this big conglomerate, this big shine in society, this grease stain, if you will, to the rest of those who actually were against chaos, and they were against punk rock, and they were the people who were still going to work from 9 to 5 in England. And it just got bigger than that. What wound up happening as time went on is they decided to go to the United States, which is where the Sex Pistols ultimately met their demise in 1978, 1979. It was the famous incident between Sid Vicious and Nancy. There's a movie called Sid and Nancy where Gary Oldman plays a Sid Vicious. For those of you who don't know who Gary Oldman is, he played the commissioner in Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. I believe he was in The Dark Knight Rises. I can't remember. I only saw the movie once. It wasn't my favorite. Anyways, so from there was this little bit of a hiatus, and that's pretty much where Public Image Limited came out. And that was Johnny Rotten's band after the Sex Pistols, and he was known as John Lydon for this band. He said, and I quote, my mind, my heart, is a Sex Pistol. My mind and my heart is a Sex Pistol. My heart and soul is Public Image Limited. So his philosophies are pretty much, I am a Sex Pistol. I am against the government. I'm going to say fuck the Queen and all these other things. Because if you remember, when God Save the Queen came out, it was #1 on the charts. And they were arrested. There was chaos. And then they went to the United States. And people greeted them. The press, the police, they greeted them thinking it was going to be chaotic in the airport. Come to find out, they were just a bunch of guys coming off the plane, and everything was fine and dandy. So time goes on after Public Image Limited, after the passing of Sid Vicious and Nancy, unfortunately, and of course it was to drugs. Some say Sid did it, some say it was a drug dealer. In the movie Sid and Nancy, they actually implicate that it was in fact Sid Vicious. Never been proven. He actually died of a drug overdose while he was in jail, or while he was out on bail and he was arrested. Time goes on after that where the punk rock movement started getting a little more hardcore. It got more violent. It got more vicious. Black Flag, The Germs, Gangrene, The Circle Jerks, Flipper. All these bands that played in all these different cities. And it was going on when the Sex Pistols and all that were happening in England and started branching over into the United States. And the United States started it with MC5. And when MC5 was playing, the Sex Pistols were in England. So it started becoming worldwide. And the Ramones honestly thought that it was going to be the Sex Pistols and their band, the Ramones, that was going to be like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin of the time. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The hardcore movement was more brutal and vicious than anyone had anticipated. There were bands that were cheering and doing this to a song that implicated, that was against rape. But they didn't catch that message, and they got vicious and violent by charging the stage, bashing into the band. If you remember Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten, their picture where they're all busted up and bloodied, yeah, that was when they had full beer cans chucked at them. And when they still continued playing, that's when the fans turned over. And you're not going to hear about that in the documentary put by Time Life DVD with the history of rock and roll. They do not discuss that. If you want to actually know what happened and get the full story on it, I suggest watching American Hardcore, the Sex Pistols documentary, the Clash documentary, and check out Punk Attitude. Those DVDs will help you sum up the 20 some odd years you may or may not have been around, or you might have been around and not heard of it, which means you'd probably have to have been living under a rock. But I know that I personally would have been there for seeing the Pistols come to the United States if I had the chance. If I was able to see the Germs and Gangrene and Black Flag and Bad Brains, I'd have been there. Punk rock was more than just a music. It was a movement. And it was brought to my attention through this DVD that I was watching, this god-awful, horrible representation of what was going on. But if you watch this DVD, it's not a complete waste. You'll actually hear the Clash and a couple of other bands kind of getting pissed off at the Sex Pistols a little bit, taking their shots. See, the Clash had an issue with the Sex Pistols because the Clash opened up for the Pistols when they felt that it should have been the Pistols open up with the Clash. But if you look at the chart hits, if you look at what the fans actually wanted, who they were paying attention to more, yeah, Clash was B-level. And that's what pissed off the Clash and a lot of the Clash fans. Carried over to the United States with the hardcore movement when things got more vicious and violent with all these bands that I've listened to, Black Flag, Gangrene, Bad Brains, Flipper, all those bands, yeah, pretty much took to stage. And when things started getting a little messy with the violence, with the Nazi punks fuck off, if you remember, Dead Kennedys was coming around right around that time, but for some reason they are not on the American Hardcore DVD. They are not on the American Hardcore soundtrack. Their timing was interesting with punk. It was a little before and a little after, more so after the American Hardcore movement, which met its demise after only a 2-year lifespan. It was short-lived, even shorter than the Pistols. And then it carries on over into Nirvana and your Offspring and Green Day and all these other really god-awful bands that came out in 1990 to 1991. Again, another short-lived thing where people, shortly after the new wave thing, when punk rock stopped flowing with its anger and its diss on society, and we're not standing up for this, and you know, fuck the system, as stated by The Exploited, which came out again shortly after the American Hardcore movement. Those of you not familiar with The Exploited, very repetitive lyrics. Not much of talent, but definitely had their mark in history. Then you go on to the magical year of 1996, where it was the Casualties, where it was the birth of Warped Tour, in a way, where it was all these amazing bands like the Briggs when they first started out, the Casualties, Cheap Sex, Clip 45, the Voids, all these bands, and it started becoming a street punk movement. Now, what happened after 1996, as time went on, is the band's shelf life was much longer and not as anticipated as it was with the American Hardcore movement and the Sex Pistols movement in England. Carrying on through 1996 all the way up to now, there's this the self-destruction, just like what happened with Darby Crash with the Germs. Funny story about that. I want to tell you about this just after the end of the video with a little bit of trivia. When you look at the Dropkick Murphys, they're still around, they're still kicking, they're still, you know, making albums, and they're still one of the most biggest bands, especially here on the East Coast. They are amazing, they are phenomenal. They've gone through so many bagpipe players and different lead singers. I don't even remember the first guy's name, who originally was with the Murphys, but he's now in another band, and they actually opened up for the Murphys not too long ago. And the Murphys then got Al Bars, the lead singer, who's actually from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He is not Irish, nor is he from Boston, and this is a predominant Boston Irish punk band. Ken Casey, the time Spicy McHaggis, all these guys, they were originally Boston and or Irish. And there was actually an interview with Al Barr, and he says, I get shit all the time when, the band was picking on me for a while and stuff like that, because I was not what you would originally see from the Dropkick Murphys, not normally what you would see in a band like this. But he had skills. And a lot of people don't like Al Barr, and a lot of people who were fans of the Murphys when they came out with Do or Die and a couple of other small title albums, when Al Barr came onto the scene with Sing Loud, Sing Proud, and The Gang's All Here. Blackout was the, in my opinion, one of the downsides where the Murphys fans pretty much split. A lot of people were happy with Blackout. A lot of people were pissed about Blackout. I was 50-50. There were some songs I liked, some I didn't. I still stayed with the Murphys and continued listening. Then you got Flogging Molly and a couple of others that have come out between 1996 and today. It's a big gap. I mean, we're looking at over 10 years, over a decade of music. And why punk rock isn't a big thing anymore is because it's not necessarily punk rock. It's something that has evolved. It has changed. And it's got a longer shelf life with these bands. If you notice, the Cheap Sex isn't around anymore. There's so many, unorganized with, the unfortunate deaths and the band disbanding and coming back together. Against All Authority still kicking, but you don't see much of them anymore. And Against All Authority actually was one of those punk bands that got better and better. And their best album and their most recent that I know of was The Restoration of Chaos and Order. And in The Restoration of Chaos and Order, there's actually George Bush talking at the beginning. And as time goes on throughout this entire CD, they talk about circle pits. And they talk about, all ages show where it's this girl and, it's this couple and they're in love and they're watching, this band up on stage. It's phenomenal. And I actually listened to that from Serious Punk. And it was the only song they actually got the license to do was All Ages Show Tonight. And I ended up going out and picking up the album just because of that one song. And I got to tell you, it wasn't even my favorite on the album. There was, Silence is Golden, but Duct Tape is Silver. There was Circle Pit. There was there's 14 songs on this album. And it was great. I definitely recommend checking out Against All Authority for those of you guys who like rock, punk, whatever. Going on from Against All Authority, I'll take you down to the coast of Florida, over to California, where Sublime and Transplants came about with kind of the same thing that's going on down in Florida. They get the same, West Coast pop type thing, where you hear it and it sounds like it's California. You can almost picture the people, surfing like you would with Sky, with like, the way they, you can picture somebody skateboarding and doing jumps and going down a ramp. Tony Hawk Pro Skater, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 also gave this a really good image, considering they had some Sky and some punk and some rock. It was a different variations, which actually wasn't that bad if you think about it. It was actually good for a video game like that, because a lot of people were getting into PlayStation, and skateboarding was a big thing. Tony Hawk was one of the heroes. I mean, he was like Michael Jordan. It was, everyone wanted to see Tony Hawk. I actually got an autograph from him, which is cool. So, 2010, May 19th, I got to go and see Public Image Limited. This band did a reunion tour, their first one in 18 years. That was, like I said, Johnny Rotten's second band, where he went known as his real name is Johnny Lydon. And it was opera mixed with punk, which I found to be really interesting. And as Henry Rollins, lead singer of Black Flag, the most recent of ones, they went through many, many lead singers. And eventually ended up with Henry Rollins, which was gold. You couldn't have asked for a better lead singer than Henry Rollins, especially for his time, his knowledge, his lyricism, his knowledge on music, and his opinions, and his poetry and his quotes. A phenomenal guy, and Black Flag will be remembered forever because of Henry Rollins. And he said that he found Public Image Limited to be much more interesting than the Sex Pistols. He thought that Johnny Rotten went a better route with that. Well, I went all the way down to New York City, bought my ticket, gunned it to New York City, had no idea where I was going to sleep, nothing. And I wanted to see Johnny Lydon. I wanted to see this guy live performing. before I died, before my time was up. And if I ever had a chance to see him, I was going to take it. And I saw it and I took it. And I was treated like gold for that in New York City. There was this girl. She was awesome. We went bar hopping together. I was 20 years old. I got to go bar hopping. It was great. How I was able to pull that off was all because of her. You know, she gave me the bracelet and everything from the show. I was a tourist, lost my wallet, stuff like that. It was totally cool. But they did that because I was willing to come all the way down from New Hampshire to New York City to go see that show. But that's not why I went to go and meet people. As much as I love people, that's not why I went. I wanted to go and see history. I wanted to be there in the same city where the Sex Pistols arrived in 1977, 1978. I wanted to see that. And I got to. If you ever hear Public Image Limited or the Sex Pistols ever going on a tour, take the chance and go. Circle Jerks played at Warped Tour a few years back. If you ever get a chance to see them, I mean, these guys are landmarks in history. I mean, this is like seeing Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd. As much as the Sex Pistols dogged on Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, they didn't want the music. They didn't like the music. They were sick of hearing the music. They went and did their thing. So, the trivia portion of this video. Did you know that the Sex Pistols and the Ramones were actually having a bit of a tit for tat on who started the movement? And did you know that the Sex Pistols never ever called themselves punk? Everyone else did. They just went out and did their thing. It wasn't punk rock to them. If you look back, the Germs. Darby Crash, the lead singer of the Germs, looked at his band and said, "We will be as big as the Beatles." The reason why no one knows about Darby Crash, really, unless the people who are really interested in the band and never heard of his death, is because in the same 2 hours he committed suicide and overdosed on heroin. That assassination of John Lennon is what stole the headlines. "We'll be as big as the Beatles," he says. John Lennon gets shot. Overdoses in the same 2 hours to try and make the band famous. It was just after their final show of the Germs. They did the Darby Crash band, and they did a couple of other groups. I know Pat Smear went on to go and do something, but the Germs have been showing an appearance in the past 4 years, and their new lead singer, actor Shane West. I shit you not. The guy from A Walk to Remember, the guy who played in ER, got his role as Darby Crash. Lorna Doone and Pat Smear were so impressed by this, they made him the lead singer of the Germs. And let me tell you, Shane West, despite some of the things that he's played in, is damn good. He's no Darby Crash. No one could ever be Darby Crash. But Shane West pulls it off, and he does phenomenal work with this band, and the band likes him. The reason why no one hears about punk rock anymore, the reason why punk is starting to fade away, is because not only has it changed and evolved into something else and blended in with all these other things after the new wave, and this Skrillex and all these different bands and all these different things that where punks are interested in, their punk rock, it kind of spread out because its shelf life was so long. And us as human beings have such a short attention span. We've become a melting pot. And that's pretty much what happened. And I got a little fun fact for you about Sex Pistols member Steve Jones. You guys know Great Milenko. Steve Jones and Slash both did guitars on the Great Milenko album. True fact. True fact. You can go look that up. Used it in my senior thesis, actually, back when I did on the Sex Pistols. Did you also know that Violent J, Shaggy 2 Dope, Blazy Dead Homie, and Anybody Killa evolved from some of the rap groups that came out from the 90s? And that from the 90s, rap actually came out from punk rock? That's right. Punk rock was the ground, the centerfold, where rappers started getting involved. And it was commented on in the DVD Punk Attitude, where, wait a second, they wear the jewelry and they wear the bling, but punk, they're almost embarrassed by riches, and that's what these symbolize, these giant these giant gold charms, these silver charms, the silver chain, the gold stitched jeans and shit like that. Punk's embarrassed by riches. They don't like riches. They'd rather throw into a fire. And that's how Tupac, NWA, all that started. And I'd personally like to thank Ice-T for that, because when Ice-T came out with the song Cop Killer when he was in a hardcore punk band, he later went into rap, which was, an awesome trail, an awesome road paved for rappers, for a new music industry. And instead of punk fading away, it grew into something better. Look at 1976, look at 1986, and look at 1996. Every 10 to 20 years, punk comes back, thrown in your face with something new because of one band and a movement that's short-lived. This is the longest that punk has ever been around, really, for the band's shelf life. The Murphys still taking strong after over 10 years. It's phenomenal. It's amazing to actually see a band keep it together and keep going. And they've changed labels. They went from Hellcat to like a couple of others. But it all stays the same. And that's what's important right now, is to understand there isn't so much selling out like New Found Glory. New Found Glory actually faded after they started going into a bigger record label. They started dropping because their fans were backing them when they were underground. You see the same thing with Anti-Flag. And I could name a dozen others where they started down at the pits, got a little famous through MTV, VH1, and then just dropped off the face of the earth. No one knows what happened to them. I don't know what Anti-Flag's doing right now, and a lot of people lose interest because of that. You have such a short lifespan. Either you're the one who meets the demise of your band, or the fans do it for you. So what's going on with ICP right now? They're going against the FBI, as I stated. The Sex Pistols went against the Queen of England. Our founding fathers said, I would like to see the government, and this was something they had spoken of, every 50 years, I want to see a revolution. There should be a revolution where the people do not tolerate their government at hand, the authorities at hand, and use the power to switch it over, to flip it upside down, and make it theirs again. That way we can rebuild. Hence, restoration of chaos and order. You need to have chaos in order to have order. Order needs chaos. Get the picture? It's called balance. It's called chaos theory. If you don't know what chaos theory, look it up. But if you want to talk about the evolution of music, and you want to talk about garbage bands like Nirvana, they were not punk. There was something that happened where Offspring, Nirvana, and Green Day got their inspirations from other bands, just like those bands did, but were not considered punk rock. And the fact that people like CM Punk, who was actually in WWE Magazine, who is in fact a punk rocker, he's what they call straight edge, which came from Minor Threat and Black Flag and a couple of other bands who talked against drinking and drugs and fucking and all these other things. And they were not necessarily religious, but Christian punk came out, which blended from the straight edge movement. And the straight edge movement was actually still violent and vicious just as much as the hardcore movement was. It was the subculture to the subculture. Am I losing you? So when you look at Green Day and their inspiration, and you look at CM Punk and he says, yeah, Green Day when they came out with Dookie, that was punk. That was not punk. There was nothing punk about it. It was a blend of new wave, and that was it. It actually, and Offspring was the same way. There was nothing punk rock about them. People even say, it's a band that keeps doing all those covers and shit. Social Distortion. They're not punk. They are far from it. They've got a couple of their own songs, and then they remake a bunch of others. But to me, that is nothing but punk rock. But if you watch the movie Punk Attitude, they will tell you that even the internet is considered punk because of the things that people are doing. You can make your own music. You can do this. You can do that. It's all DIY. And that's a big thing with punk rock is DIY. So what is punk to you? You could talk about a senator standing up in front of a bunch of people who's a Republican, and let's say it's the gun deal. And he says, no, we should actually put restrictions on guns. that in some people's minds would be considered punk. So, are you at heart and your mind and your soul a punk rocker? If you're doing your YouTube thing and you're doing all your do-it-yourself things and you're trying to make money with what you've got, whether it's your guitar, your drum set, your ideas, your YouTube, whatever it is considered punk. Comment below. Let me know what you think. If this video was interesting to you, I'd love to talk more about punk rock with you guys. Peace.